Aziza Kingdom was a land of beauty, prosperity, and tradition, but among its many wonders, none was as captivating as Susan. With a radiant glow that seemed to set her apart from others, she was admired by men and envied by women. Her skin was as smooth as polished gold, her deep brown eyes sparkled like the morning sun, and her long black hair cascaded down her back in waves of perfection. Her laughter was like music, and her graceful movements made it seem as though she was floating rather than walking. It was no surprise that almost every young man in the kingdom longed for her attention, dreaming of the day they might win her heart. Despite the admiration she received, Susan remained humble. She never allowed the compliments to make her arrogant, nor did she seek attention. She preferred to live a quiet life, tending to her daily tasks and interacting kindly with everyone she met. She often helped elderly women carry their goods in the market and played with the little children in the village square, earning the love and respect of many. Unlike other young women who spent hours adorning themselves to attract suitors, Susan found joy in simple things, watching the sunset by the river, gathering wildflowers, or listening to the elders' stories about the kingdom's history. Many noblemen, merchants, and even wealthy farmers in the village spoke highly of Susan, hoping to one day approach her for marriage. Young men would often steal glances at her as she walked through the village, whispering to one another about her beauty and kindness. The village women, though sometimes envious, could not deny that Susan had a natural charm that drew people toward her. Even those who secretly wished to see her fail could not find a single flaw in her character. It seemed as though she was destined for a great and promising future. But fate had its own plans for Susan, plans far different from the dreams of the men who adored her. Though she was admired by many, life was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. Behind her radiant smile and graceful demeanor lay a world of sorrow and suffering she had yet to face. And as the winds of change began to sweep through Aziza Kingdom, Susan's destiny was about to unfold in ways no one could have foreseen. Susan's life took a devastating turn on what seemed to be an ordinary morning. The sun had barely risen, casting golden hues across Aziza Kingdom, when a messenger arrived at her home with a grim expression. The news he carried shattered her world. Her parents had been involved in a fatal accident while traveling to a neighboring village. The moment she heard the words, Susan felt as if the ground beneath her feet had vanished. Her hands trembled, and her heart pounded in her chest as tears welled up in her eyes. The weight of grief was unbearable, and as she rushed to the palace where their bodies had been taken, she prayed that it was all just a terrible mistake. But it was no mistake. When Susan saw their lifeless forms, her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, weeping uncontrollably. Her father, a respected trader, and her mother, a kind and gentle woman, had been everything to her. They had provided her with love, comfort, and protection. Now, they were gone, leaving her completely alone in the world. As she cried beside them, the elders of the kingdom offered their condolences, but their words could not ease the unbearable sorrow gripping her heart. She wished she could wake up from the nightmare, but reality was cruel, and there was no escaping it. The entire kingdom mourned her parents, as they had been well loved by all. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by nobles and commoners alike, but none felt the loss as deeply as Susan. Dressed in mourning garments, she stood beside their graves, feeling the cold emptiness of loss wrap around her like a suffocating cloak. She had always believed that her parents would be with her forever, guiding her into adulthood, witnessing her wedding, and celebrating her victories. Now, all of those dreams were shattered, leaving her with nothing but pain. She felt lost, uncertain of what the future held for her. In the days that followed, Susan struggled to cope with the emptiness left behind. Their home, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a hollow shell. Everywhere she looked, she was reminded of them, the chair where her father used to sit, the kitchen where her mother used to hum as she cooked, and the garden where they had spent countless evenings together. It was unbearable. But as much as she wanted to hide from the world, life did not stop for her grief. Decisions had to be made about her future, and soon, she would find herself under the care of someone who did not share the love and kindness of her late parents. After her parents' passing, Susan's life was no longer her own to control. According to the kingdom's customs, an orphan child was to be taken in by the closest living relative. Unfortunately for Susan, that relative was Stella, her father's second wife, a woman known for her cold and calculating nature. Although she had been married to Susan's father, she had never cared for the girl, always keeping her distance while focusing on her own daughter, Pamela. Susan had never felt welcome in Stella's presence, and now, she had no choice but to live under her roof. Moving into Stella's home was like stepping into a prison. Unlike her parents' house, which had been filled with love and warmth, this place was rigid and unwelcoming. Stella made no effort to console Susan in her grief. Instead, she treated her as a burden, constantly reminding her that she was living in her house out of pity. The first night Susan spent there, she cried herself to sleep, clutching the last piece of jewelry her mother had given her, a golden bracelet that now felt like the only link to the family she had lost. Stella wasted no time in making it clear that Susan was no longer a cherished daughter but an unwanted guest. While Pamela enjoyed the luxuries of fine clothes and delicious meals, Susan was given old, worn-out dresses and scraps of food. The difference in treatment was glaring, but Susan knew she had no power to change it. She bore the mistreatment in silence, determined not to show weakness. She reminded herself that her parents had raised her to be strong, and she refused to let Stella's cruelty break her spirit. Despite the unfair treatment, Susan did her best to remain obedient and hardworking. She completed every chore given to her without complaint, hoping that if she proved herself useful, Stella might soften toward her. But it was wishful thinking. No matter how hard Susan tried, Stella remained cold and distant, treating her like nothing more than a servant in her own home. The days turned into weeks, and Susan slowly realized that she was no longer considered part of the family. She was merely an outsider, surviving in a place where she was not wanted. Life under Stella's roof quickly became unbearable for Susan. At first, Stella only ignored her, making it clear that she was not welcome, but soon, her hostility grew into something far worse. She assigned Susan all the household chores, treating her like a servant rather than a grieving stepdaughter. Every morning before sunrise, Susan was expected to sweep the entire compound, fetch water from the distant stream, cook breakfast, and wash the family's clothes. While Pamela lounged in the comfort of her room, Susan worked tirelessly, often going without food if she didn't complete her tasks on time. Stella's cruelty extended beyond mere labor. She constantly belittled Susan, scolding her over the smallest mistakes and finding reasons to punish her. If a plate broke, she accused Susan of being careless. If dinner wasn't to her liking, she forced Susan to redo it, sometimes making her stay up late into the night. There were even times when she would strike Susan for things she had not done, blaming her simply because she could. Susan longed for the love and warmth she once had with her parents, but in Stella's house, love was a foreign concept. Pamela, seeing how her mother treated Susan, followed in her footsteps. She laughed whenever Susan was punished and made fun of her whenever she was forced to do the most humiliating chores. "You're nothing but a beggar in our house," Pamela would sneer, tossing her silky hair over her shoulder. "You should be grateful we let you stay here at all." These words stung, but Susan held her tongue. She had no one to defend her, and fighting back would only make things worse. Instead, she endured, hoping that one day, fate would take her away from this misery. Despite the suffering, Susan remained kind and hardworking. She refused to let bitterness consume her. Whenever she had a free moment, she would sit under the old mango tree in the backyard and whisper to the wind, speaking to her parents as if they could hear her. She prayed for strength, for a way out, for something, anything, to change her fate. But as the days into weeks, and the weeks into months, it seemed that happiness was nothing but a distant dream. Pamela took great pleasure in making Susan's life miserable. Every chance she got, she would taunt her, finding new ways to remind Susan of her misfortune. "Look at your dirty hands, always covered in ash and water," Pamela said one day as she lounged under the shade of a tree while Susan scrubbed the family's clothes. "You were once the daughter of a noble trader, but now, you're just a lowly servant." She laughed mockingly, her rich garments contrasting sharply with Susan's tattered dress. Susan clenched her jaw but remained silent. She had learned long ago that responding would only make things worse. Pamela was cruel, but Susan refused to let her words break her spirit. She focused on her work, ignoring the laughter that echoed around her. But Pamela was not satisfied. She stepped closer and deliberately spilled a bowl of water over the freshly washed clothes. "Oops," she said with a smirk. "Looks like you'll have to wash them again." Tears welled up in Susan's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She wanted to scream, to tell Pamela how unfair this all was, but she knew Stella would only punish her if she complained. So, without a word, she picked up the soaked clothes and began washing them again. Pamela, seeing that she had failed to provoke a reaction, scoffed and walked away, her laughter ringing in the air. This was Susan's daily life, endless chores, relentless teasing, and a deep loneliness that weighed heavy on her heart. But even in the darkness, she held on to hope. She told herself that one day, she would escape. One day, she would no longer have to bow to Pamela's cruelty. And until that day came, she would endure. The more time passed, the worse Stella's cruelty became. Susan was given even more work, sometimes forced to stay up all night preparing food or mending clothes. She was never allowed to eat at the same table as Stella and Pamela. Instead, she was made to eat in the kitchen, often finishing their leftovers. If there was nothing left, she would go to bed hungry. Pamela found new ways to make her life miserable, often spilling drinks or food just so Susan would have to clean up after her. One evening, as Susan was carrying a tray of food, Pamela deliberately stuck out her foot, causing Susan to stumble and drop the tray. The plate shattered against the floor, and the loud noise brought Stella rushing in. "You clumsy fool," she shouted before delivering a harsh slap across Susan's face. "Do you know how expensive these plates are? You're nothing but a useless girl." Pamela watched with satisfaction as Susan clutched her burning cheek, tears brimming in her eyes. "Maybe she should sleep outside tonight," Pamela suggested cruelly. Stella smirked. "That's a wonderful idea." That night, Susan was forced to sleep outside on the cold, hard ground, her body shivering from the chill of the night air. She hugged herself tightly, wondering if this nightmare would ever end. As she lay there, staring at the vast sky, she thought of her parents. She remembered how her mother used to tuck her in at night, how her father used to tell her bedtime stories. A sob escaped her lips. Would she ever be happy again? Would she ever know love and warmth? Or was she doomed to suffer for the rest of her life? Despite the hardships, Susan never let go of hope. One day, as she was fetching water from the river, an old woman approached her. She was dressed in simple garments, but there was wisdom in her eyes. "My child," the woman said, "I have watched you from afar. You are strong, despite all the pain you have endured." Susan was taken aback. No one had spoken to her with kindness in a long time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. The old woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small charm. "Take this," she said. "It is a symbol of hope. No matter how dark things may seem, never stop believing that your fate can change." Susan hesitated before accepting the charm. As she held it in her hands, she felt a strange warmth spread through her. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though the universe had not forgotten her. Maybe, just maybe, things would change. Maybe her suffering was not without purpose. With renewed determination, she returned home, clutching the charm tightly. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she would not give up. As Susan grew older, her beauty became even more evident. Despite the hardships she endured, there was an unbreakable grace about her that captivated anyone who saw her. Her deep brown eyes held a quiet strength, and her kindness made her even more alluring. Soon, wealthy suitors from all over the Aziza kingdom began to take notice. Rich merchants, noblemen, and even high-ranking officials came to Stella's home, seeking Susan's hand in marriage. They offered gifts of gold, fine fabrics, and livestock, believing that such wealth would convince Stella to agree. However, Stella had no intention of letting Susan marry into wealth. She viewed Susan as nothing more than a servant, someone whose misery she controlled. If Susan were to marry a wealthy man, she would escape Stella's grasp and find happiness, and Stella could not allow that. So, one by one, she rejected the suitors with excuses. Susan is not ready for marriage, she would say. She is still grieving her parents. Or, she is not a suitable wife, she is too clumsy and weak. Each time a suitor left disappointed, Susan felt a flicker of hope die inside her. Pamela found the entire situation amusing. Can you imagine, she sneered one evening? Men of great status coming to ask for you? It's laughable. You look like a beggar, and yet they think you're worth marrying. She flipped her hair and smiled smugly. Mother is wise to reject them. You belong here, scrubbing floors and washing my clothes. Susan, though deeply hurt, remained silent. She had stopped hoping for kindness from Stella and Pamela. Yet, as she lay awake at night, staring at the wooden ceiling of her small room, she wondered what her life could have been like if Stella had allowed her to marry. Would she have been happy? Would she have finally been free? The thought lingered in her mind, but reality quickly reminded her that she was still a prisoner in her own home. With Susan's suitors turned away, Stella shifted her attention entirely to Pamela. She was determined to make her daughter the most desirable woman in the kingdom. She showered her with the finest garments, expensive jewelry, and fragrant oils. Pamela was pampered like a princess, never lifting a finger to do any work. You are destined for greatness, my dear, Stella would say. One day, you will marry a prince. Pamela believed every word. She walked through the village with her head held high, looking down on those she deemed beneath her. She spoke arrogantly to other girls, boasting about her beauty and how she would soon become royalty. Many villagers disliked her attitude, but they dared not say anything, knowing that Stella was just as proud and would defend her daughter fiercely. Meanwhile, Susan watched from the shadows, knowing she could never be treated the same way. It was clear that Stella had no love for her. While Pamela was praised, Susan was insulted. While Pamela received new clothes, Susan wore the same worn-out dresses. The unfairness of it all weighed heavily on her heart, but she refused to let bitterness consume her. One day, she whispered to herself, my fate will change. However, that day still seemed far away. As Pamela basked in her own pride, Susan remained in the background, forgotten by all except those who wished to mock or mistreat her. Still, she held on to hope, believing that her suffering would not last forever. The sun hung high over the Aziza kingdom as the sound of galloping horses echoed through the streets. A royal procession, adorned with shimmering banners and golden chariots, moved steadily toward the palace. The long-awaited moment had finally arrived. Prince Desmond was home. After years of being abroad, studying, and preparing for his future as king, he had returned to the land of his ancestors. The entire kingdom had been buzzing with anticipation for weeks, and now, their prince was finally in their midst. Villagers rushed to the roadside, eager to catch a glimpse of the young royal. Women whispered among themselves, admiring his regal posture and confident demeanor, while children waved excitedly, their eyes filled with wonder. The men of the kingdom observed in silent respect, acknowledging the presence of their future king. The prince, clad in an elegant tunic with the royal emblem embroidered across his chest, rode with an air of quiet authority. Though his face was unreadable, it was evident that he had changed since the last time he was seen in Aziza. At the palace gates, King Pascal and Queen Evelyn stood waiting, their faces filled with pride as they watched their son approach. The royal guards, dressed in their finest armor, stood at attention, their spears raised in salute. As the prince dismounted his horse, the palace servants quickly moved to receive him, bowing deeply in reverence. The grand doors of the palace swung open, welcoming him back into the heart of his home. Without saying much, he stepped inside, his mind already lost in thought. Meanwhile, across the kingdom, the news of his arrival spread like wildfire. In every household, every market square, and every gathering place, people spoke of nothing else. Though they did not yet know the purpose of his return, one thing was certain: Prince Desmond's homecoming would mark the beginning of great change. The news of Prince Desmond's return spread through the Aziza kingdom like wildfire. From the grand halls of the palace to the smallest villages, everyone was eager to know what would happen next. The prince had been away for many years, and now that he had returned, the people speculated about his plans. Merchants in the marketplace whispered about whether he would take over the affairs of the kingdom, while noble families anxiously waited to hear if he was ready to choose a bride. Women of all ages, from wealthy noble daughters to humble village girls, secretly hoped to catch his attention. At the palace, the royal council discussed the prince's next steps. King Pascal was aware of the growing curiosity in the kingdom, but he remained patient. He knew that his son had just returned and needed time to settle back into his home. Queen Evelyn, however, was already thinking about her son's marriage. It is time, she told the king one evening. Desmond is of age, and he needs a strong and beautiful queen by his side. The king nodded but chose not to pressure his son just yet. Instead, he decided to give Desmond time to decide his own future. Meanwhile, in the village, Susan heard about the prince's return through overheard conversations at the marketplace. She was curious but knew that it had nothing to do with her. The affairs of the royal family were far beyond the reach of a girl like her. Pamela, on the other hand, was excited. She had convinced herself that the prince would surely notice her beauty and choose her as his wife. A prince deserves a queen like me, she boasted to her mother, Stella, who eagerly supported her daughter's ambitions. As the days passed, the excitement in the kingdom only grew. Nobles prepared grand feasts, hopeful families polished their finest jewelry, and young women practiced their curtsies. Though the prince had not yet announced his intentions, everyone knew that something important was about to happen. The kingdom held its breath, waiting for the next move from the future king. Prince Desmond sat in his chambers, gazing out at the vast gardens of the palace. The scent of blooming flowers filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. He had returned home to take his place in the kingdom, but there was something more pressing on his mind, his future. During his time abroad, he had seen many things, learned about leadership, and understood the importance of having a strong queen by his side. But choosing a wife was not something he wanted to rush. His father, King Pascal, had not yet pressured him, but Desmond knew it was only a matter of time before the discussion of marriage would arise. The kingdom expected him to settle down and start a family. He had met many women in his travels, but none had captured his heart. He wanted more than just beauty, he wanted someone with strength, kindness, and intelligence. But where would he find such a woman? As he pondered his future, his mother entered his chambers with a warm smile. "You seem deep in thought, my son," she said gently. Desmond turned to her and sighed. "I have been thinking about my future, mother. I know that soon, I must choose a wife." Queen Evelyn nodded in understanding. "A king's choice in a queen is important, but do not rush, Desmond. The right woman will reveal herself in time." Her words gave him comfort, but they did not answer the question that troubled him: who would be the one? The prince spent the next few days walking through the palace gardens, attending council meetings, and observing the people of his kingdom. He wanted to understand them better before making his decision. But deep in his heart, he knew that something, or someone, would soon change his life in ways he never expected. After much thought, Prince Desmond finally approached his father. He found King Pascal in the royal study, reading ancient scrolls. The king looked up as his son entered and smiled. "Come, sit with me, Desmond. You have been quiet since your return." The prince took a seat and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Father, I have been thinking about my future. I know that the kingdom expects me to marry." The king set aside his scrolls and studied his son carefully. "And do you feel ready?" he asked. Desmond exhaled slowly. "I do not wish to delay it for too long, but I also want to make the right choice. I need a woman who is more than just a princess or a noblewoman. I want someone with a kind heart, someone who will stand by me as an equal." The king nodded in approval. "That is wise, my son. A queen must be strong and compassionate. But tell me, do you have anyone in mind?" Desmond shook his head. "Not yet, but I want to find her in my own way. I do not wish to be forced into an arranged marriage." King Pascal leaned back and smiled. "Then let us make it official. We shall announce to the kingdom that you are seeking a wife, and we will allow the best women to present themselves before you." Desmond agreed, though he still wondered if this perfect match even existed in the kingdom. As the meeting ended, Desmond felt both relieved and nervous. The announcement of his search for a queen would change everything. Soon, the women of Aziza Kingdom would compete for his attention, but he had no idea that fate had already chosen someone for him, someone far different from what he expected. A week after Prince Desmond's conversation with his father, the royal trumpets sounded across the kingdom. Town criers gathered in the village squares, and messengers rode through the streets, spreading the news. King Pascal had officially declared that the prince was ready to choose a bride. The royal palace would hold a grand selection where the prince would choose from the most eligible women in the kingdom. Excitement filled the air. Every family with a daughter of marriageable age took the news seriously. Mothers prepared their daughters, teaching them how to walk gracefully, how to speak eloquently, and how to present themselves as future queens. Tailors worked tirelessly, stitching the finest dresses for the upcoming event. Young women whispered among themselves, dreaming of a life in the palace. Pamela, in particular, was overjoyed. She had always seen herself as someone destined for greatness, and this was her opportunity. "Mother, I will be the queen of Aziza Kingdom," she declared confidently. Stella smiled, already envisioning her daughter sitting beside the prince. She began making arrangements to ensure Pamela would outshine every other girl. Meanwhile, Susan overheard the news as she fetched water from the village well. Her heart stirred for a moment, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She knew Stella would never allow her to participate. "A girl like me could never be chosen," she whispered to herself. But deep down, a small part of her wished for something more, something she never thought possible. The entire Aziza Kingdom buzzed with excitement as preparations for the royal selection intensified. Every girl of noble and common birth dreamed of being the chosen one. Families who had long hoped for a connection to the royal family spent their days strategizing, selecting the finest gowns, and coaching their daughters on proper royal etiquette. Markets overflowed with tailors working tirelessly to create dazzling dresses, and jewelers showcased their most exquisite pieces, hoping to attract wealthy families preparing their daughters for the grand event. In the village, Pamela was filled with pride as she paraded through the streets, boasting about her impending selection. "The prince won't look at anyone else when I step forward," she declared to anyone who would listen. Stella, her mother, reinforced her confidence, ensuring that Pamela would have the most expensive dress and jewelry. Unlike many other hopeful girls, Pamela was convinced that she had already won the prince's heart before even meeting him. To her, the competition was nothing more than a mere formality. Susan, on the other hand, remained in the shadows, watching the excitement unfold from a distance. She had accepted that she would never be allowed to participate. Stella had made it clear that Susan's role was to serve, not to dream of royalty. Even though Susan had long admired the prince from afar, she knew better than to hope for the impossible. "Dreaming will only bring pain," she whispered to herself, forcing her heart to ignore the growing yearning inside her. As the royal selection day drew closer, anticipation reached its peak. The palace guards patrolled the kingdom, ensuring that order was maintained as travelers from far and wide arrived to witness the grand event. The people eagerly discussed the prince's potential bride, with bets placed on the wealthiest and most beautiful ladies. No one suspected that fate had something unexpected in store for them all. As Susan carried out her chores, she couldn't escape the murmurs of the young women around her. They spoke of how the selection would change their lives, how their families had prepared them for the event, and how the prince's future wife would soon be chosen. Although Susan pretended not to care, a part of her longed to see the grand selection. Not because she believed she had a chance, but because she wanted to witness the moment that would define the kingdom's future. One evening, as she fetched water from the well, she overheard a group of women discussing how some noble families were using influence and wealth to secure their daughters a spot on the list. "The prince will never choose a commoner," one woman scoffed. "Only women from prestigious families will stand a chance." Susan sighed, realizing that even if she were allowed to participate, her background alone would have disqualified her. She had nothing to offer, no wealth, no noble blood, and no family name to support her. Yet, as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't silence the tiny voice inside her heart that whispered, "What if? What if, by some miracle, she was given a chance? What if the prince saw beyond riches and titles?" She quickly shook the thought away, knowing that such dreams would only lead to disappointment. Besides, Stella would never let her step foot near the palace. As the selection day approached, Susan resigned herself to her fate. She would remain in the background, watching from afar as Pamela and the others pursued the life she could only dream of. But little did she know, fate had already set events in motion that would change her destiny forever. Stella had spent weeks planning Pamela's entrance into the royal selection. She had spared no expense in ensuring that her daughter would stand out among the competitors. The finest silk had been used to craft Pamela's gown, and the most dazzling jewels adorned her hair and neck. But Stella was not content with mere presentation. She wanted to eliminate all competition. To ensure Pamela's victory, Stella had begun bribing palace officials, hoping to secure Pamela a spot in the prince's final selection before the event even began. "We cannot leave this to chance," she whispered to Pamela one evening. "I have made sure that when the prince looks at you, he will see only perfection." Pamela smirked, fully confident that everything would go according to plan. But Stella's scheming didn't stop at bribery. She also worked to ensure that any girl she deemed a threat would be subtly removed from the selection process. Rumors were spread, lies were whispered, and certain noble families found themselves mysteriously discouraged from sending their daughters. Stella was determined that Pamela would be the only real option for the prince. Despite all of Stella's careful planning, she had overlooked one thing: fate. No matter how much she tried to manipulate events, destiny had its own path to follow. And as the kingdom prepared for the grand selection, an unforeseen twist was about to change everything. Pamela delighted in her mother's schemes, believing herself to be the most deserving candidate for the prince's hand. She carried herself with even more arrogance than before, treating the other girls as if they were beneath her. "You all may as well stay home," she taunted one group of hopeful women. "The prince will have eyes only for me." The others glared at her, but they knew better than to argue. Stella's influence was strong, and Pamela's confidence made it difficult to challenge her. One afternoon, as Susan cleaned the front yard, Pamela approached her with a smug grin. "You must feel so small, Susan," she sneered. "Watching from the shadows while the rest of us prepare for greatness." Susan remained silent, refusing to engage in Pamela's cruel games. "It must be painful," Pamela continued, "knowing that I will soon be queen while you remain nothing but a lowly servant." Susan clenched her fists, but she said nothing. Arguing with Pamela would do no good. Yet, Pamela wasn't done. "I should make you my personal maid when I become queen," she laughed. "You can serve me in the palace, watching as I live the life you can only dream of." Pamela's laughter echoed in Susan's ears, but instead of anger, something new stirred inside her: determination. For the first time in her life, Susan felt a fire ignite within her heart. She had spent years enduring mistreatment, accepting her fate without question. But Pamela's words had awakened something deep inside her. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but one thing was clear: her story wasn't over. The selection day was now only a few days away, and the village was filled with last-minute preparations. Tailors worked from morning till night, perfecting the dresses of the noble women. Hairstylists practiced intricate designs, and the wealthiest families made their final arrangements to ensure their daughters would have an advantage. The excitement in the air was undeniable. Stella spent hours inspecting Pamela's gown, making sure that not a single detail was out of place. She also hired servants to fan Pamela and keep her cool, as she did not want her daughter to appear anything less than perfect. Every move Stella made was calculated, ensuring that Pamela would stand out above the rest. Susan, meanwhile, continued with her usual chores, ignored and forgotten as always. But something about the coming selection felt different. Though she had no place in it, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow her fate was about to change. She just didn't know how. And as the sun set on the eve of the selection, the kingdom waited with bated breath. Tomorrow, the prince would make his choice. Tomorrow, lives would change forever. And for Susan, tomorrow would mark the beginning of a journey she never expected. The long-awaited day had finally arrived, the day when Prince Desmond would begin his selection for a future bride. The entire Aziza kingdom buzzed with anticipation as the royal palace prepared to welcome young maidens from all over the land. Families had spent weeks making their daughters look their best, ensuring they wore elegant dresses and displayed the finest manners. For many, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be chosen by the prince himself. From dawn, the palace courtyard was filled with excitement. Young girls, dressed in their finest gowns, stood in perfect lines, their faces glowing with both hope and nervousness. Parents whispered words of encouragement, while onlookers gathered around, eager to witness the selection unfold. The air was thick with murmurs and anticipation, as everyone awaited the moment when the prince would step forward and begin the process. Inside the palace, Prince Desmond prepared himself for the important task ahead. Though he had returned home to much celebration, he knew that today's event would shape the rest of his life. His father, King Pascal, had emphasized the importance of choosing wisely, reminding him that a queen must possess not only beauty but also intelligence, kindness, and strength. The prince took a deep breath as he adjusted his royal robes, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Meanwhile, Stella was busy making sure Pamela looked perfect. Dressed in a luxurious gown, Pamela stood at the front, her confidence evident in the way she carried herself. "Today is my day," she whispered to herself, convinced that she would be chosen. Susan, however, was nowhere near the palace. Burdened with endless chores given by Stella, she had no idea that fate was about to change her life forever. The day of the selection had finally arrived, and the entire kingdom was abuzz with excitement. Young women dressed in their finest gowns, their hearts filled with anticipation. Noble families held their heads high, certain that their daughters would be chosen by Prince Desmond. Stella, ever the schemer, was confident that Pamela would be among the prince's final picks. However, there was one person Stella refused to allow anywhere near the selection, Susan. Determined to keep Susan out of the prince's sight, Stella devised a cruel plan. That morning, she handed Susan a basket filled with dirty laundry and ordered her to go to the river at the far end of the village to wash them. "Do not return until every piece is spotless," she commanded, her eyes gleaming with malice. Susan's heart sank. She had secretly hoped to at least catch a glimpse of the selection from afar, but now she had no choice. She picked up the heavy basket and trudged towards the river, her steps slow and reluctant. Pamela, dressed in a gown of gold and purple, smirked as she watched Susan struggle. "Make sure you don't return until nightfall," she taunted. "We wouldn't want your filthy presence ruining the selection." Susan bit her lip and held back tears. She had long learned that crying wouldn't change her fate. As she walked away, she whispered to herself, "Perhaps it's better this way. I was never meant to be part of this world." Unbeknownst to Susan, fate had other plans. While she thought she was being sent away to be forgotten, destiny was about to pull her into the center of everything. The palace courtyard was filled with an air of excitement and tension as Prince Desmond continued his careful selection. 9 young women had already been chosen, each one standing proudly at the front, their faces glowing with hope. The people of Aziza Kingdom watched with bated breath, eager to see who would be the final candidate. However, the prince hesitated, his sharp eyes scanning the remaining women as if searching for something more. Pamela, who had been selected early on, stood confidently, her arms crossed as she eyed the other hopefuls with smug satisfaction. Stella, standing among the crowd, held her chin high, feeling victorious. As far as she was concerned, there was no girl in the kingdom more suited to be queen than her daughter. Yet, she was also keenly aware that the prince had not yet chosen the 10th girl. Her confidence wavered slightly as she noticed his uncertainty. The other young women stood nervously, their gazes shifting toward one another. Some whispered prayers under their breath, while others fidgeted with their dresses, hoping to make a final impression. The prince, however, remained deep in thought. He had expected to complete the selection quickly, yet something inside him held him back. He had been taught from childhood that instincts were just as important as logic, and his instincts told him that he had not yet found the right 10th candidate. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as the delay stretched on. The king, seated on his grand throne at the head of the courtyard, observed his son closely but did not interfere. He had always trusted Desmond's judgment. The kingdom waited, watching intently, unaware that fate was about to take an unexpected turn. The sun hung low in the sky as Susan carried her water pot toward the village well. Her arms ached from the day's endless labor, but she pushed forward, knowing that any delay would result in punishment from Stella. She had spent the day scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and preparing meals, all while Pamela and Stella dressed in their finest garments to attend the prince's selection. Susan sighed, wishing for a life beyond suffering, but she knew dreams were dangerous in her world. As she reached the well, the distant hum of voices caught her attention. She turned her head slightly, noticing a large crowd gathered near the palace gates. The excitement in the air was palpable. It was the day of the selection, the moment when Prince Desmond would finalize his choice of 10 potential brides. She had known about it, of course, but Stella had ensured she had no time to even think about it. Yet, something in her heart urged her to steal just one glance before returning home. Slowly, she approached the edge of the gathering, her presence unnoticed amidst the sea of villagers. She watched in silence as 9 women stood proudly before the prince, each one radiant and full of hope. Then, she saw Pamela among them, her posture exuding arrogance. Susan bit her lip. She had always known Pamela desired power, but seeing her on the prince's shortlist sent an unexpected pang through her heart. Despite everything, she felt an unspoken longing, an ache for a different fate than the one she had been given. As she stood watching, lost in thought, her water pot slipped from her grasp, hitting the ground with a loud crash. The sound rippled through the crowd, drawing attention toward her. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as people turned to see who had disrupted the prince's important moment. Susan's breath hitched as she realized her mistake. She had never intended to draw attention to herself. Yet, in that moment, Prince Desmond's gaze met hers for the first time. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as Susan stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the earth and escape the stares of the villagers. Prince Desmond, however, remained still, his gaze fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He had been searching for something, though he had not known what. But now, standing before him was a girl unlike any he had seen, a girl who had not come seeking his attention, yet had stolen it completely. Pamela's eyes darkened with fury as she noticed the prince's lingering stare. She turned toward her mother, who clenched her fists in irritation. Stella had spent years ensuring Susan remained unseen and insignificant, yet here she was, standing in the middle of the selection ceremony, unwittingly capturing the prince's attention. Pamela scoffed, shaking her head. It was impossible. Susan was nothing, a mere servant girl. The prince would forget about her in a moment. But Desmond did not forget. He turned his attention back to the 9 women he had chosen, yet his thoughts remained clouded. He had felt a strange pull the moment he saw her. There was something raw, something genuine in her presence. He had been raised around women who only showed him their most polished, refined selves. Yet this girl had been caught off guard, yet held a quiet strength in her stance. He took a step forward, silencing the whispers of the crowd. I have made my choices, he announced, his voice firm yet thoughtful. But one spot remains. The people whispered among themselves, excitement and confusion mingling in their voices. Prince Desmond turned back toward Susan, his gaze steady. You, he said. What is your name? Susan's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected to be addressed by the prince himself. As Susan, she stammered, barely above a whisper. Prince Desmond nodded. Then I choose Susan as the 10th girl. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Pamela's face twisted in horror. Stella staggered back as if she had been struck. No one had expected this, least of all Susan herself. The selection had been made. And she, an orphan girl who had been beaten down her entire life, had been chosen. The moment they arrived home, Stella's anger exploded like a raging storm. She grabbed Susan by the arm and dragged her into the house with a grip so tight it felt as though her bones would snap. Pamela followed closely, her arms crossed, smirking as if she had just won a battle. You wretched girl. Stella spat, her voice shaking with fury. How dare you bring shame to this family? How dare you stand before the prince as if you are worthy? Susan trembled, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She had endured years of mistreatment, but never had she seen Stella this enraged before. Before Susan could utter a word, a sharp slap landed across her face, sending her staggering backward. The pain stung, but not as much as the humiliation that followed. You are nothing. Stella shouted, raising her hand again. Another slap, then another. Pamela stood by the door, laughing cruelly. Do you think the prince actually likes you? She mocked. You're nothing but a lowly orphan. He probably just pitied you. Susan's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She knew showing weakness would only fuel their cruelty. Stella grabbed Susan by her hair, yanking her to the ground. I have spent years making sure you remain invisible, she seethed. You were supposed to stay hidden while Pamela shines. And yet, you had the audacity to let the prince notice you? She kicked Susan hard in the ribs, making her gasp in pain. You are a curse to this family. You have brought shame upon us. Pamela giggled, watching in amusement. Mother, we should just lock her up until the selection is over, she suggested, her voice filled with malice. That way, she won't have a chance to embarrass us further. Susan curled into herself, her body aching from the brutal assault. She had hoped that being chosen would bring her closer to freedom, but instead, it had unleashed a new level of cruelty from Stella. As she lay on the cold floor, gasping for breath, she wondered if she had made a mistake by standing in front of the prince. Would this suffering ever end? Or had she just sealed her fate as Stella's prisoner forever? Susan lay on the cold floor, her body aching from Stella's brutal attack. She could barely move, but she knew she had to stay strong. Stella paced the room, her eyes burning with fury. You've ruined everything, Susan, she seethed. Do you really think the prince will choose you? A worthless orphan like you? Susan remained silent, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. Pamela smirked from the corner, her arms crossed. Mother, what if she actually goes to the palace? What if she gets chosen over me? Her voice dripped with jealousy. Stella's face twisted with anger as she turned back to Susan. She knelt beside her and grabbed her chin roughly, forcing Susan to look into her cold, merciless eyes. Listen to me carefully, Stella hissed. You will not go to the palace. You will not compete with Pamela. If you do, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Susan's heart pounded as fear crept into her chest. She knew Stella was capable of anything. I have no choice. The prince already chose me, Susan managed to whisper. Stella's grip tightened. Then I will make sure you are no longer worthy of being chosen, she spat. Pamela's grin widened as she watched her mother's fury unfold. Stella stood up and began pacing again, her mind racing with wicked ideas. If the prince sees you as unworthy, he will drop you from the selection, she mused. Then, suddenly, her eyes gleamed with a sinister idea. She turned to Susan with a wicked smile. If your beauty is what caught his eye, then we shall take it away, she said coldly. Susan's blood ran cold. She didn't understand what Stella meant at first, but the look in her stepmother's eyes told her that something terrible was about to happen. Pamela clapped her hands in excitement. Oh, that's brilliant, mother. No one will want her if she's ugly. Susan's breath hitched as Stella stepped closer. You will do it yourself, she commanded. You will destroy your own face, or I will make sure you suffer a fate worse than death. Susan's heart pounded wildly. The horror of the situation settled in, and for the first time, she felt truly powerless. She had endured years of suffering, but this was different. Stella was threatening to take away the only thing she had left, her dignity. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. Please. Don't do this. But Stella only laughed. You have until tomorrow to decide, she said coldly. Do it yourself, or I will do it for you. The night felt unbearably long. Susan sat in a small, dimly lit corner of her room, hugging her knees to her chest. Her face was still swollen from the beating, and her ribs ached with every breath. But none of that pain compared to the turmoil raging inside her. How could she destroy her own face? How could she ruin the one thing that made her stand out? She had never cared much about her beauty, but now that it was threatened, she realized how much she depended on it. It was the only reason Prince Desmond had noticed her. Without it, she was nothing. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she thought about the prince. He had chosen her, not knowing the horrors she endured at home. Would he still look at her if she were no longer beautiful? Would he even recognize her? Susan's fingers trembled as she touched her reflection in the broken mirror. Her once bright eyes were filled with sorrow. Her heart ached at the thought of ruining herself to satisfy Stella's cruelty. She wanted to believe that she had a choice, but deep down, she knew she didn't. Stella would never let her step into the palace looking as she did now. Morning arrived too soon. Susan remained in her corner, her eyes swollen from crying. Stella barged into the room with Pamela right behind her. Have you made your decision? Stella asked, her voice sharp. Susan didn't answer. She had spent the night praying for a way out, but none had come. Slowly, she reached for the sharp piece of broken glass she had hidden beneath her skirt. Pamela gasped in delight. Oh, she's actually going to do it, she whispered excitedly. Susan's hands shook as she lifted the glass. She wanted to fight, to refuse, but she knew the consequences would be far worse. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and pressed the glass against her skin. Pain seared through her cheek as she made the first cut. Blood trickled down, warm and thick. Pamela clapped her hands in glee. This is even better than I imagined, she laughed. Stella watched in satisfaction. Good girl, she said mockingly. Now the prince will never look at you again. Susan's heart shattered as she dropped the glass. She felt dizzy from the pain, but more than that, she felt broken. The dream of a better life had slipped through her fingers. As she stared at her bloodied reflection, she realized that her fate had been sealed. She was never meant to be anything more than a servant in Stella's household. Susan remained locked in her room for the rest of the day. She had no strength left, no will to fight. Every time she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, she felt sick. Pamela visited her several times just to mock her. Oh, Susan, she said sweetly, I must say, you did a fine job. I mean, I never thought you were much to look at before, but now? You're absolutely hideous. She laughed cruelly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Susan clenched her fists, but she remained silent. There was no point in arguing. Pamela and Stella had won. I hope you don't think you're still going to the palace, Pamela continued. Imagine the prince's reaction when he sees your face. He'll be disgusted. Susan swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in her throat. She had wanted to believe that her worth was more than just her looks, but now she wasn't sure. Pamela noticed her silence and smirked. Oh, are you hoping the prince will still choose you? She taunted. That's adorable. But let me make something clear, you are nothing. You will always be nothing. Susan felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had already given Pamela and Stella too much satisfaction. Pamela leaned closer, whispering, I can't wait to see the look on the prince's face when he realizes he made a mistake choosing you. She laughed again before striding out of the room, leaving Susan alone in her misery. As the door slammed shut, Susan allowed herself one quiet sob. She had lost everything, her hope, her dignity, and her chance at freedom. But somewhere deep inside her, a tiny ember of defiance remained. She wasn't sure how, but she knew one thing, this wasn't over yet. The day of the final selection had finally arrived, and the entire kingdom buzzed with excitement. The grand palace was decorated beautifully, and nobles, villagers, and royal officials gathered to witness the momentous occasion. The 10 shortlisted girls, dressed in their finest attire, stood in an elegant line before Prince Desmond, each hopeful that she would be chosen as the future princess. Pamela stood at the front, her confidence unshakable, believing she was the clear favorite. She smiled smugly, tossing her hair back as she prepared to impress the prince. However, Prince Desmond's eyes scanned the line, and his heart sank. Something was missing. Or rather, someone. He had chosen 10 girls, but only 9 stood before him. His heart clenched as he realized Susan was absent. Had she refused to come? Had she been forced to stay away? Unease settled in his chest. He turned to his father, King Pascal, who watched carefully. "Father, where is the 10th girl?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Before the king could respond, a commotion erupted at the palace gates. Gasps filled the air as the crowd turned to see a fragile figure stumbling into the courtyard, her steps hesitant but determined. Susan had arrived. But she was not the same as before. A long veil covered most of her face, and her once radiant eyes were filled with sadness. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd as she moved forward. Stella and Pamela, seated among the spectators, stiffened in shock. Prince Desmond's breath hitched. Despite the veil hiding most of her features, he recognized her presence, her strength. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Let her approach," he commanded. The guards hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Susan to walk toward the selection platform. As she stopped in front of him, the prince's voice was gentle yet firm. "Susan, why are you hiding your face?" The room fell silent, waiting for her response. Slowly, Susan lifted her trembling hands and pulled back her veil. A collective gasp echoed throughout the hall. A deep, jagged scar marred the once flawless beauty of Susan's face. The sight sent a shockwave through the crowd, leaving many in stunned silence. Pamela smirked slightly, believing that Susan's ruined face would cost her everything. However, when Prince Desmond took a step closer, his expression was not one of disgust, but of fury. His sharp gaze moved from Susan to the crowd, searching for answers. "Susan," he said, his voice calm yet intense, "who did this to you?" A heavy silence filled the air. Susan's hands clenched at her sides as she gathered her courage. Then, with a deep breath, she turned toward Stella and Pamela, who were desperately trying to avoid her gaze. "It was them," she said, her voice unwavering. "My stepmother, Stella, and her daughter, Pamela. They forced me to disfigure myself, so I wouldn't stand a chance of being chosen." The entire hall erupted into whispers of shock and outrage. The queen's hand covered her mouth in horror, while King Pascal's expression darkened with fury. "Is this true?" the king demanded, his booming voice shaking the walls. Stella leaped to her feet, shaking her head frantically. "Lies. She's lying. She ruined her own face," she cried. Pamela clung to her mother's arm, tears welling in her eyes. "Please. I was supposed to be the princess," she wailed. But Prince Desmond was unmoved by their pleas. "Guards," he ordered, his voice ringing with finality, "arrest them both." The guards wasted no time. Stella screamed as they seized her, and Pamela fell to her knees, sobbing. The crowd watched in silence as they were dragged out of the palace, their fate sealed. Prince Desmond then turned back to Susan, his expression softening. He reached out and gently lifted her chin, looking deep into her eyes. "True beauty is found in the heart," he murmured. "And yours is the most beautiful of all." The king stood and addressed the court. "The selection has ended. Prince Desmond has made his choice." The prince smiled, turning to Susan. "I choose you, Susan." Cheers erupted through the hall as Susan's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy. No longer an orphan. No longer unwanted. She had finally found her place. And as the prince took her hand, she knew that this was only the beginning of her new destiny.